Welcome to the GSMC Car Podcast, the show that takes you on a journey through the automotive world. We talk about the latest news, from new makes and models to new technology to all of the must-have options available. Whether you're a fan of the old classics, love the latest models and technology, or have never met a vehicle you didn't want to work on, the GSMC Car Podcast has something for every car enthusiast.
Welcome to the GSMC Car Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, David Lucy Mabel. Okay, folks, well, the 1970s are over. The latest fuel crisis of 1979 is in recent memory, but it is still past, and now it is time for the 1980s. We have been doing a series on the most influential cars from each decade, and I would like to present to you what I believe is the most influential car, or in this case, a group of cars, that is the most influential in the 1980s, which would be the Chrysler Minivans. These cars would be the Dodge Caravan and the Dodge Grand Caravan, the Plymouth Voyager and the Grand Voyager, and the Chrysler Town and Country, which actually didn't come until 1990. But the Dodge and the Plymouth variants of this platform came out in 1984, which would put it right smack in the middle of the 1980s. And let me tell you, these were an influential automobile indeed. So let's get started. The Chrysler Town and Country, we're going to start out with the introduction. We are going to go into the specifications. We're going to be going into some other cars of the era that were also influential. And, of course, segment 4 will always be my final thoughts, in which I have some fond memories of the Chrysler Minivans of this time period. Because, mind you, I was born in 97, so these cars were still on the road by the time I was born. I mean, they were barely, 15 years old at that point. So there were plenty of families still driving them around. And of course, not just the first generation, the second generation, the third generation, all of which I witnessed growing up. So let me put that there for you. So anyways, in the introduction, we have already said that all of these are essentially the same vehicle. They would continue to be so throughout their entire model run. Plymouth would eventually end up going out of business. Chrysler would end up canceling Plymouth, I want to say in the late 90s, early 2000s. So, but the Grand Caravan and the Town and Country would continue up until recent memory. I think the latest of which, the last model year for the Chrysler Town and Country and Grand Caravan were probably 2016 or 2017. So just barely 5 years ago, they stopped producing these vehicles. So yeah, they would continue on their same model throughout the same platform throughout their entire run. Even in the mid to late 2000s, the Volkswagen Routan was also built on the same platform as the Grand Caravan and the Dodge and the Chrysler Town and Country as well. But that is not part of this because that's a vehicle that came much later on. This is not part of the original class of vehicles that really invented what we know as the minivan. The Plymouth Voyager and the Dodge Grand Caravan came out in 1984, and the Chrysler Town and Country came out in 1990, like I said. And they were still built on the same platform. These vehicles were a classic example of what we would call badge engineering. Badge engineering is essentially when a company offers the same vehicle under different marks and charges different prices for them. For example, allow me to put it this way. Let's see if I can think of an example. Let's see. Okay. I'm blanking for an example that would be relevant to Americans, to American car consumers right now, because all the other ones I can think are like JDM cars that have been brought over to America and that are known as something different, but I'm sure there's something here in the United States that we can draw a comparison to. I mean, Well, okay, let me put it this way. There's the GM Epsilon platform that came out in 2012, I believe, where it was the Chevy Impala, the Buick LaCrosse, and the Cadillac XTS. They were all the same car mechanically, and they just had different bodies and different badges on them. That's an example of badge engineering. Not quite as shameless as the badge engineering committed by Chrysler during this time period, because the vehicles literally looked exactly the same except for a different grille. These cars look a lot more different, and to the untrained eye would be different cars. But I, who know car platforms, I would say, I would tell you that those are badge engineered cars, but that's just an example. So badge engineering was something that Chrysler was doing at the time, and they could turn a profit on essentially the same vehicle, because what they would do, Plymouth was at the bottom of the line, Dodge was mid-level, and then Chrysler was at the top. So the Plymouth would be the bare bones model, and then the Dodge would have some creature comforts, and then the Chrysler would be the luxury model, in which had leather seats, automatic, windows, and other sorts of foolishness. So that's how they end up charging more for just a couple of up trimmings of the same vehicle, and they could charge significantly more for it. And well, as the success of these vehicles would prove, people actually paid for it. So they had begun this class of vehicles, that is, the earliest stage of development in the 1970s as a joint project between Ford and Dodge's truck division. Now, little do people know that Ford and Dodge did have a partnership for a time period. I can't quite tell you off the top of my head, but Ford and Dodge did have a partnership for a time period. We tend to think as the big three here in America as being distinctly different companies, in which today they are, but not so much in history. I mean, Cadillac was started from the Henry Ford Company. Henry Ford had the Henry Ford Company from like 1896 to like 1903. He hit financial difficulty. He was about to shut it down. Henry M. Leland got it out from under him and then started Cadillac. Well, Henry M. Leland would leave Cadillac, would start Lincoln. Ford would come to Henry M. Leland, start and buy Lincoln from him and include it under Ford's umbrella. They are all related in some way, shape, or form. It's like the royal families of Europe. They may not seem related, but, King Felipe of Spain is Queen Elizabeth's third cousin. King Leopold II is her first cousin 3 times removed. I mean, it's all the same family, just different branches. It's all the same family, just different branches when it comes to, the car manufacturers here in America. But anyway, enough about this. They had started developing this in the 1970s. They were supposed to be an alternative to the Volkswagen bus, in which you will find out, obviously, they were successful in doing that. At first, the design stage didn't make it past the clay model. Lynn Townsend, who was the chairman of Chrysler, said, if the market for such a vehicle had existed, Ford and GM would have already made it. Now, let me pause on that, because I would like... God gracious. Thus is the problem with Chrysler. Chrysler's had issues, honestly, probably since the late 60s, early 70s. Chrysler has had issues. And that's one of the issues. If the chairman of a company says, there's no point in us starting a new segment of car because our competitors would have already started it, if there was a need for it, wouldn't you think a good chairman would say, hey, they haven't thought of it, we have thought of it, why don't we try it out and see what happens? But no, that's not what he said. So, as it would have, the company's project to start this minivan in the 70s would end up going dormant. It would go dormant for the next 4 or 5 years. Meanwhile, at Ford, they had created a prototype of their version of the vehicle that was based off of a Ford cargo van that they had at the time. Well, Ford never put that into production because I think probably the same thing was said at Ford and said, oh, well, the market for the vehicle doesn't exist, so it'll stay in the prototype stage only, and then we'll never actually put it into production. Well, guess what ended up happening in 1977? The van project at Dodge would be revisited. And in 1978, Lee Iacocca, the famous Lee Iacocca, had been fired from Ford, and then he had joined Chrysler. So he would come to Chrysler, and by 1979, the platform was developed with the same engine and transmission as the K cars, which were also a brainchild of Lee Iacocca in an attempt to save Chrysler from going bankrupt. the car would use, well, the van actually, would use various components from existing K cars at the time, including the 4-cylinder Mitsubishi engine. It would finally be launched for the 1984 model year. So let me just tell you how brilliant Lee Iacocca is. Lee Iacocca is commonly credited with inventing the minivan. Though he was not the one who literally sat down on the piece of paper and then started drafting designs for this thing about a decade before it actually came out, he was the one who put the plan into action. So even though he technically was not the inventor of the minivan, he was the one who marketed it and made it viable. Because if they had let it up to the Chrysler chairman at the time, Lynn Townsend or whatever on earth his name is, then they would have never gotten around to this. And I can tell you, if Chrysler had not started the minivan, Chrysler would have gone bankrupt. The 1980s were a critical time for Chrysler because, like I said, fuel crisis of the 1970s really hit Chrysler hard. It hit all of them hard. Chrysler ended up discontinuing Imperial, and frankly, Chrysler wasn't making money on Imperials. I think there was some statistic out there that said, don't quote me on this, but there was some statistic that said that Chrysler, lost money on every single Imperial they built because the cars were just so expensive to build. So after, the gas crisis hit, people don't want, cars that are going to be taking 8 miles to the gallon and that are 20 feet long and 7 feet wide. Nobody wants these land barges. So Chrysler discontinues that, and then Chrysler is scrambling to find something that's viable in the market. So by the time Lee Iacocca comes to Chrysler, he's like, we're going to develop a K car. A K car is essentially built on the same platform. They built station wagons, coupes, convertibles, and sedans, all on this same platform. And then they marketed them through badge engineering as different levels in the different companies that they had at the time. So there were Chrysler K cars, there were Plymouth K cars, there were Dodge K cars, there were all sorts of different sorts of K cars. All because of Lee Iacocca. So now Chrysler is just barely coming out of their struggles with the K car that just got them to break even instead of going into bankruptcy. They need something else to stimulate production. They need something else to stimulate business. So what do? They come out with a minivan. And whose idea was this? Lee Iacocca. Why? Because Lee Iacocca is a genius. So he allows them to manufacture these minivans and to put them out on the market, all while doing it fairly cheaply too. Having the same engine and the transmission as the hundreds of thousands of K cars that were already being developed. So that way, the factories didn't have to retool, essentially, when it came to producing the engines. All they had to do was produce the engines and slap them inside of a minivan instead of a Dodge Aries, let's say. I don't know if that was a K car. That's just some, car from the 80s that came to my mind. It might not have been a K car. But instead of like a Chrysler LeBaron or something, that was definitely a K car. All they had to do was take the engine and transmission that was already so popular, that was already being used, and put it in the new vehicle that they just developed. That way they could make hundreds of thousands of them and not have to worry about spending so much money. And the thing is, these things would be so successful because you'll find out in the next segment, they were way more practical than the station wagon that the K cars were built off of too. There was a K car station wagon that, was marketed under different names in the different marks of Chrysler at the time. But all of them were essentially the same car, and none of them were as practical as the minivans. The minivans revolutionized the way the American family would travel. I mean, the Chrysler Minivans, of all the cars that, that are still relevant today, I would say the Chrysler Minivans are near the top of the list. Because let me just say something real quick before this segment ends. The 1887 or the 1886 Benz Patent Motor Wagon, that was a great car. But to tell you the truth, unless you're a car enthusiast or a car historian, nobody remembers them. They're not relevant in today's, world. The 1894 Deere, no longer relevant. The Ford Model T, as well known as it is, it's no longer relevant. And then I can continue going. The Duesenberg Model J, no longer relevant. The Chrysler Airflow, no longer relevant. The Volkswagen Beetle, still sort of relevant, but they're not making it anymore. And then in the 1950s, the Citroën DS, no longer relevant. Their technology that they use in the Citroën DS is still relevant today, but not the car itself. 1960s. What was the most influential car of the 1960s? Let me go back and look. The Lamborghini Miura. Like I said, technology from the Miura, the layout of the Miura is still relevant today, but the car itself, not so much. The AMC Pacer. What the AMC Pacer stood for, which was an economy car, still is relevant today, but the car itself is no longer relevant today. But these Chrysler minivans, they are still relevant today, because guess what? Chrysler, the Mark Chrysler, the only thing they got left, aside from their 300, their aging 300, guess what? Is a minivan. Chrysler has been known for minivans, and all the minivans that Chrysler have made since then trace their roots back to these original minivans back in the 1980s. The Chrysler minivan is still a viable option for families today. Obviously doesn't go under the same name anymore. It's called the Pacifica now, but it's the same concept, same vehicle, same class, same section of the market. The Chrysler vehicle or the Chrysler minivan is still a viable option for families today. You got a family with 4 kids? You know what? A Chrysler minivan is definitely on your shopping list of cars to buy. You may not go with it, but you will consider it. Most people do. So there you have it. I mean, the Chrysler minivan, like it or not, will continue to be relevant for a long time. Maybe not forever, because eventually all things must pass away. All car trends come and go as history moves along. But the Chrysler minivan, as far as I'm concerned, is here to stay. So let's move on to the segment 2 after the break, in which we are going to be discussing the specifications. Now, this is what made this car or this class of vehicles really shine compared to the other people haulers of the day, the station wagons. So please stay tuned.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Okay, welcome back, folks. So in the first segment, we discussed the history of the Chrysler minivans and essentially why they are still important and relevant in today's world. So we're going to move on to the specifications. This will be the most important segment of this podcast, and this will be the most important thing about this car, because to tell you the truth, the history behind it doesn't really matter much. I mean, the history behind it doesn't really matter much, because to tell you the truth, it's, people, the average person doesn't care. When you're talking about a minivan and talking about how relevant a minivan is, nobody really cares about the development of the minivan. People care about the development of the Ford Model T because it was absolutely revolutionary. But people don't really care much about the development of the minivan. What people do care about, I will say, people care about how spacious they are, what the concept behind the specifications. That's what people buy a minivan for. People don't buy them because, this is a historical, influential vehicle, even though it is, but that's not why people buy it. So I'm going to tell you why people buy minivans, because of their specs. So get this. This was the main marketing point of this new class of vehicles, because the American public had known what a van was. Vans had been used for cargos, for ages now, probably since the 60s. So the concept of a van was pretty familiar to the average person in America. However, the concept of a minivan solely used for hauling families and being more car-like was a new idea. Nobody had thought about that. Because if you wanted to haul your family around, you got a station wagon. That's what you did. You got a station wagon, or in those days, sedans were also used as family cars because most sedans had bench seats and they all sat 6 people. That's a good family vehicle right there. But nobody thought of converting or not converting, making the cargo van more car-like and then calling it a minivan. Chrysler was the first one. Of course, there had been minivan-like vehicles. I mean, the Volkswagen bus, that was kind of like a minivan. And there was a Scout Scarab way back in like 1936 that was like a multi-purpose vehicle. That was sort of like a minivan. But the Chrysler minivan was the first true minivan. Now, let me explain you these specifications now that I've, gone on a tangent there. The minivans, as compared to the other people movers that Chrysler had at that time, the K-car station wagons, they were 2 inches shorter, but 2 inches wider than the K-car wagons. And they doubled the interior room of their wagon counterparts. So get this, you could have a wagon, and then the wagon was narrower and longer than the minivan, just by barely even noticeable, but you can double the cargo room. How they managed to do that, I don't know. I'm not an engineer. I've never driven a K-car wagon. I've never driven a Chrysler minivan either. Well, actually, I drove a Dodge Grand Caravan a few years ago, but that's besides the point. I have not driven one of these original Chrysler minivans. So I don't know how they managed to do that, but the point is, they did. The standard seating configuration was 5 passengers, 2 front bucket seats, and a middle bench seats that's at 3 people. But they also came in 7 or 8 passenger variants as well, with the addition of a 3rd row. The K-car wagons could do the same thing. They could sit up to 7 people. So they weren't that much off from a minivan. And if you had a bench seat across the front, a bench seat in the middle, and then 2 fold-away seats in the back, that's 8 people right there too. But you have to think of it. The ones in the Chrysler minivan, all of the seats folded, and the minivan is a lot taller. It's so much more practical and so much easier to load people in and out of the minivan because of how it was built. These minivans were the first production cars with cup holders. That's saying a lot, because you got minivans like the Honda Odyssey Elite now that have like 18 cup holders. They're meant for hauling families. You got a family, your car seats 8 people. Let's say you got a mom, a dad, and 6 boys and girls, all of which are their children or their children and their children's friends, and you're going to like a soccer match or something across the state. You're going to want that many cup holders. You're going to want that practicality that comes with a minivan. Essentially, what a station wagon is nothing more than a hatchback sedan, essentially. It's lengthened and it has a hatch. That's what a station wagon is. It's based off of a sedan. It's not very tall on the inside. Loading and unloading could be cumbersome because you couldn't access the 3rd row of a station wagon through the door. You had to access it through a hatch. And then if you needed to carry any appreciable cargo room, you had to put down the rear 2 seats that faced backwards in many cases. You really couldn't do that with a station wagon. Granted, the station wagon would be holding on for at least a decade longer. The station wagon in America really died as far as, family transportation. The station wagon really died in 96 with the ending of the GMB body wagons. Ford had done away with their wagons probably since the late 80s, early 90s. Chrysler had done away with their wagons once their minivans had come out. So the wagon would be on death's doorstep. Not to say that the wagon wouldn't come back, but the wagon would come back as sort of a novelty vehicle and much more European-esque. It would not come back as a family hauler. There are modern American wagons, Cadillac CTS wagon, Buick Regal Touareg, but those are not people haulers. They can haul people, but they're not people haulers. They're more so of a practical, sporty vehicle. Or somewhat of a low crossover, not a true wagon, like the wagons of the 90s and before. So the minivan would have good reason to kill the wagons, because as much as I'm biased towards station wagons, and as much as I would never drive a minivan, I gotta give credit where credit is due. A minivan is a lot more practical than a station wagon, especially at this time period. And these were the days before everybody and their cousin was driving a crossover of sorts. So this is what it was. This is how the Chrysler Minivan basically took over the people mover market as far as family, vehicles go. So these minivans not only were the first one with cup holders. It is important to note that the first editions of these vans, just like I had said, were the Dodge Caravan and the Plymouth Voyager. The Grand Caravan and the Grand Voyager were longer wheelbase models that came out in 1987. So from 1984 to 1986, they had just one wheelbase available. And then in 87, they had lengthened the wheelbase. So now they had lengthened the wheelbase, like 5 or 6 inches. Even more cargo room, while still keeping the 5-passenger standard seating, and then offering 7 or 8 passengers optional seating. Now, if you lengthen that, you can add all that cargo and all of those people, and still have a vehicle that's of manageable size. You see where are you catching my drift here? You can't do that with a station wagon. There's only so much you can do with the platform of a station wagon before it no longer becomes a station wagon and it's something else more so like a minivan. When you really think of it, station wagons spawned, a large variety of vehicles. Station wagons spawn the sport wagon. Station wagons spawn what they call a shooting brake, which is like an exotic sports wagon, if you will. Station wagons spawned hatchbacks. Station wagons spawned minivans, and station wagons spawned SUVs. They all started off as a station wagon, and then that was more specialized, and as it became more specialized, it evolved into what we now know as, the different cars today. Hatchbacks, shooting brakes, SUVs, crossovers, minivans, all of them originated from the station wagon. So the station wagon had its place in American society. It evolved into other things. So today we've got modern equivalents of station wagons. The modern equivalents of station wagons would be your minivans and your crossovers. Those would be your modern equivalents of station wagons because they carry the same function as station wagons of old did. So now that you have that established, not only did they lengthen them, I must mention the doors. And I know I'm going to sound like Doug DeMuro over here freaking out on some weird doors on a car, but this is not something that was ever done before. The doors were a huge selling point on these vehicles. Though they originally were to have 4 conventional doors, Chrysler opted to have 3 doors. Now let me tell you why. A reasonable person would say, well, 4 doors are more practical than 3 doors. Why did they decide to have 3 doors instead of 4 doors? I'll explain you why. The front 2 doors were conventional doors. The rear single door was a sliding door. So what does that mean? What is a sliding door? Anybody who's listening to this in the modern times obviously knows what a sliding door is. But allow me to explain it to you so I can sort of make you understand what it was like to be a person in the 1980s, never had seen a vehicle like this. A sliding door, what it is a door that does not open all the way. It opens and slides on a track. So you open and push it out, and then it slides on a track, and then instead of opening out on a hinge, it's mounted on a track, and then it just stays on the side of the vehicle. Perfect for entering and exiting a minivan, because these cars were designed to be as practical as possible. There was not much thought given into making them pretty or making them stylish because, frankly, nobody buys a minivan to be pretty or to be stylish. You buy to haul your family. And that it did. Because when you have a sliding door can be a lot larger than a conventional door because you're not pushing it and pulling it to open it. You're sliding it on a track. A sliding door allows you to have a much larger opening. And that way, instead of some, other vehicles of the time period in which you would have to fold a rear seat in order to get access to the back seat, you didn't have to do this on a minivan. All you would have to do is open up the sliding door, and then there would be a large enough gap in the side of the vehicle for you to enter the middle row and then for you to enter the back row with little difficulty. That was a huge selling point. And the reason why there was only one of them is because, frankly, one was all you needed. When you're loading and unloading people and you're driving in the United States, everybody drives on the right side of the road. The curb that you would pull over to unload and load vehicles would be on the right side of the road. So the door, the sliding door that is, was on the right side of the vehicle. It was so practical, you didn't need two sliding doors. Eventually, minivans would have two sliding doors. But the first ones, they didn't need it. And even today, you really don't necessarily need a sliding door or two sliding doors on a minivan. All you really need is one, because largely you're going to be entering and exiting off of the side of the vehicle, off the side of the road. That was their logic behind that. So not only did they have a very large opening in the vehicle, but it allowed them to unload and load passengers a lot easier. The Dodge and the Plymouth that came out in 1984 were offered with a 4-cylinder, a turbo 4-cylinder, or a Mitsubishi 6-cylinder engine. The Chrysler that came out in 1990 only offered the Mitsubishi 6-cylinder. So there you have the specifications of these minivans, and you understand why people flocked to buy them. They were the vehicle that saved Chrysler. Now, of course, Chrysler has managed to screw themselves over again, goodness, with their poor quality and their poor reliability, and they've merged with Stellantis now. So merging with Stellantis, goodness, we'll see, maybe Chrysler products will make a comeback. Who knows? Or maybe Stellantis might opt to kill the Chrysler name. But if we were to transport ourselves about 40 years ago in 1981, when these cars were in development, and then in 1984 when they finally came out, this would be the vehicle that would decisively save Chrysler from bankruptcy and irrelevancy. It was the Chrysler Minivan. And who do we have to thank for lighting a fire under the feet, so to speak, of the people who were developing it? Lee Iacocca. It was his idea to get an existing engine and transmission and slap it into a minivan body. Thus, to cut the cost and to make tons of them with lots of parts availability so they would be as practical could be. That's what Lee Iacocca wanted to do, and by gosh darn it, goodness, that's what he did. Thus, saving Chrysler with the minivan and starting such a lucrative market of vehicles. Because minivans don't only exist here in America. You can find them all over the world. This is a world-changing vehicle, thus it being the most influential vehicle of the 1980s. So stay tuned. I will tell you about some other vehicles in the 1980s, as well as some history that was going on at the time. So don't go anywhere. I'll see you after the break.
Are you a business owner? Someone interested in the latest news that might affect your business? Then check out the GSMC Business News Podcast, a show dedicated to keeping you up to date on all things concerning business, technology, and the stock market. Get a head start on the day as we keep you updated on the latest goings-on Wall Street, money, jobs, and technology. The GSMC Business News Podcast has you covered.
Alrighty, folks, so here we are back. So let's take a break from discussing the minivans solely, and let's take a look at some other vehicles that came out in the 1980s. And some other things that happened in the 1980s, just to put it into perspective of what were the 80s like. Besides the fact that the world hit puberty in the 80s, everything was awkward, car styling was awkward, clothing was awkward. Music was good, though. Music was good from the 80s, but Everything else, though, yeah, everything else was awkward. That's when the world hit puberty. But besides the point. History and the other cars of the 1980s. There was the Lamborghini Countach. The Lamborghini's iconic 80s flagship supercar. The first one to feature wedge-shaped styling and scissor doors. Now, mind you, the Lamborghini Countach was a direct successor to the Lamborghini Miura. Direct successor to the Lamborghini Miura. So what it was their supercar and their flagship supercar. This was the one that, every 90s kid, or not even a 90s kid, every 80s kid had a poster of it on their wall. This was supposed to be the coolest thing. The Countach was the icon of the 80s. You think of the 80s and you think Lamborghini, you think Countach. I'm not sure if the Countach strictly came out in 1980s, though. It might have been the 70s. It came out in the 70s. But it was popular, most popular in the 1980s. Not a ton of them were made, but it's a Lamborghini supercar. So not a ton of them were made. But by the way, Tyler Hoovy has bought one. So he has it, and there's like a video of his 5 things he loves and 5 things he hates about it. So you all should probably go check that out. I'm not paid by Tyler Hoover to say that. I just really like him, and I really think his videos are great. So you should really go watch them. But, of course, there was the Acura Legend. Now, the Acura Legend was an influential vehicle. Let me tell you how. One of the first Japanese luxury vehicles to be produced for the U.S. market. And it was also the beginning of Acura, the luxury mark by Honda. Now, let me put this into perspective. The Japanese have long been making luxury vehicles for their own market, obviously. There was, the Nissan President, and there was the Toyota Century that I did a podcast on. There was the Mitsubishi Debonair and the Isuzu Dictator and all sorts of different quirky, Japanese luxury vehicles. But the Japanese had not really ever brought a luxury vehicle over to the United States. Now, in this time period, late 80s, early 90s, the Japanese car companies, the big 3 of Japan, Nissan, Toyota, and Honda, would all come out with luxury marks that were solely to be sold in the United States. And even to this day, you can't find some of these marks in Japan unless they've been imported. For example, Acura does not exist in Japan. It's Honda over there. All of the Acuras that we get over there are Hondas over in Japan. The Nissan turned luxury was Infiniti. There is no Infiniti in Japan. It is Nissan in Japan. Lexus is Toyota turned luxury. There was no Lexus in Japan. Now there is Lexus in Japan. But for the longest while, up until recently, there was no Lexus in Japan because Lexus was developed solely for the American market. So the Acura Legend was one of the first Japanese luxury cars to be brought over, and thus the start of Honda's luxury division, Acura. Now, granted, Acura, was not the one to combat Mercedes-Benz or BMW. That was Lexus, really. Lexus was really the one that was up at the upper echelon that was really trying to target the Germans. But what the other ones, Infiniti and Acura, were trying to do, they were trying to offer an alternative to what I guess, and I can't quote this, but what I guess, an alternative to American luxury cars. Because when you think of it, American luxury cars of the time period were large and inefficient. Large, inefficient, not very stylish. You have this sleek vehicle, this Acura Legend. It comes out, it's front-wheel drive, it's built well, super reliable, and costs just about the same as, let's say, a Cadillac DeVille of the time period. But then you got the Cadillac DeVille, old frumpy styling, big chrome bumpers. Yeah, it was front-wheel drive. Yes, it was trying to be modern, but no. The Cadillac, Lincoln, all of them, they couldn't keep up with the stylishness, if I could put it that way, of the Japanese luxury vehicles that came out. And not to mention, they were all so much more fuel efficient than the American counterparts. There's a reason why Japan came over and to start producing cars in the first place to bring to America, and then to start producing luxury cars to bring to America. Because the Germans took what was the high-class stuff. Because in order to stay alive through the fuel crisis, Lincoln and Cadillac and Chrysler had to make cars that were more affordable, which they were a victim of their own success, as Bill from Auto House in Naples would put it. He has a YouTube channel called Curious Cars. You should also check that out. Also not paid by him. But he would put it into perspective that the American vehicles were a victim of their own success. They had to become cheaper in order to survive the fuel crisis. Well, after that being done, then you would have executives who used to drive Cadillacs because Cadillacs were, really expensive. Then their constituents that worked under them would be driving Cadillac too. And of course, as an executive, you just can't be seen driving the same, Cadillac as the man who works for you. So, what he logically does, perhaps arrogantly, goes and buys a Mercedes-Benz. Well, how about the younger folks who don't want a frumpy old Cadillac? What do they buy? But they want a luxury vehicle. And they don't have enough money for a Mercedes-Benz. They buy an Acura. They buy an Infiniti. They buy a Lexus. Because they are lots cheaper, more fuel efficient, better built, frankly, and a lot more stylish than the American counterparts, and not as insanely expensive as the German cars of the time period. The Japanese cars filled in that market segment, and today they still do, because like it or not, Lincoln, Cadillac, and Buick are still seen as old people cars. Maybe Cadillac, not so much, but Buick and Lincoln, for sure. But Acura, nobody's ever called an Acura an old person car. Nobody's ever called an Infiniti an old person car. Nobody's ever called a Lexus an old person car. Well, who started it all? The Acura Legend. Acura Legend came to the United States to set a standard for Japanese luxury vehicles, and to this day, that still stands. Cadillac Alante. Speaking of the devil, Cadillac. It was a Cadillac with an Italian body designed by Pininfarina, a major attempt at Cadillac to combat the European automakers. Here's the problem with Cadillac. Cadillac made a car, but Cadillac did not give the car the proper formula it would need to be successful. All these American car makers must have been convinced that the way to combat the effects of the fuel crisis and the way to combat the incoming cars was by modernizing their cars and making them front-wheel drive. Here's the problem with that. A front-wheel drive car will never offer as much performance as a rear-wheel drive car. And a front-wheel drive car, to tell you the truth, is a lot more complex to maintain than a rear-wheel drive car. Because a front-wheel drive car doesn't have a traditional transmission. It has a unit that's called a transaxle. It's a transmission and a differential that would go on an axle. And then you have to manufacture that. That's complicated, and it tends to not be as reliable. Well, you making the American cars, which at this time, goodness, didn't have necessarily a reputation for reliability. You're trying to modernize them, and then your decision to modernize them is to have them have the same formula, like the same build formula, front engine, front wheel drive, as an economy car, but have all the trimmings of a luxury car. So you've got this weird in between. Because the German cars, far and wide, were all luxurious, but they were all rear-wheel drive automobiles. And then the Japanese cars, far and wide, were not luxurious, except the ones I mentioned, but they were built for economy, fuel economy, so they were all front-wheel drive. Then you have got the Americans who can't make up their mind. They don't know if they want to build economy cars, they don't know if they want to build luxury cars, so they build a smattering of both. You've got a front-wheel drive luxury car. That's what happened to the Cadillac Alante. The Cadillac Alante would have benefited so much if it were rear-wheel drive and if it were reliable. Because you get the German cars of the late 80s, early 90s were super well built, super reliable. Built to go 150 miles per hour for 6 hours on the Autobahn. That's like the standard for them. You have to be able to do that. And then the Japanese cars were not built for that. They were built for efficiency and economy. The American cars had neither. They didn't have efficiency or economy, and they did not have build quality. Thus is the Cadillac Alante. And not only that, Cadillac lost money on every single Alante it made, because their bodies were literally shipped from Italy on a modified Boeing 747 to come to the United States, because the bodies were built by Pininfarina in Italy, and then they were flown to the United States to be assembled with the chassis and the engine. Thus is the car. Horribly expensive. And what are you paying? You're paying $100,000 equivalent in today's money for a car that's front-wheel drive, unreliable, with American build quality. Yeah, it looked pretty, but that was about it. It was all style and no substance for the Cadillac Alante. And the reason why I put it on this list as one of the other influential cars of the 1980s, it would influence Cadillac's decisions for, probably the next 20-something years before Cadillac would finally snap out of it and start offering rear-wheel drive cars in the, in the mid-2010s to start combating the Germans for real this time. Because up until recently, the Cadillac cars mostly were front-wheel drive. If not front-wheel drive, they were rear-wheel drive, but with not the same build quality as the German cars. The Cadillac Alante would set a tone. Not just for Cadillac, it would set a tone for the other American car companies as well, trying desperately to attract people away from the European automakers, yet not making them as reliable, or not desirable either. So now here we have some history from the 1980s. The Berlin Wall would collapse in 1989, thus spelling the beginning of the end of the Soviet Union and the Cold War that had been going on since 1945, since the end of World War II. The Soviet Union would end up collapsing 2 years later in December of 1991, after the wall came down in Eastern Germany in 1989. In 1981, the IBM personal computer is released, thus starting an era of personal computing that would change the world over. There's not a person alive today that does not know what a computer is. Granted, if you're living in a first world country. And if you don't know what a computer is, then your life has been affected by it in some way, shape, or form. In some way that you haven't even been able to realize. And then, sadly, the AIDS epidemic became recognized in 1980 and gripped the world in fear and misunderstanding, as well as a lot of anti-gay sentiment and a lot of anti-black sentiment. Because a lot of times it was either Africans or gay people that struggled with AIDS that were the majority of people that had AIDS, and it created a horrible stigma of the time. And if you watch The Crown, this is not, this is not car related, but if you watch The Crown in the last episode, season 10, or season 4, episode 10, you would see that Diana, on her visit to New York, visited an AIDS hospital and hugged one of the children, violating the stigma of the time period that these people were like the modern day lepers, unclean. And then, of course, Michael Jackson, the king of pop, rose to fame and popularity during this decade as well. My dad could tell you all about that because he was born in 1967 and he grew up in the 80s, listening to Michael Jackson, curling his hair, doing all sorts of 80s foolishness. But that was the time. So there you have it. The 1980s, some history, and some cars. Now, let's move on to segment 4, in which I will discuss my personal feelings about this class of vehicles that we had been discussing, the Chrysler Minivans. Moving on, and see you after the break.
Do you work in the world of marketing and advertising? Are you a media buyer or the owner of an agency? Have you been looking for a podcast to help stay on top of all the goings-on of those worlds? The GSMC Marketing News Podcast is dedicated to keeping you up to date on all things concerning marketing and advertising. Get the latest marketing news, from what major businesses have planned for the coming year, to the newest trends in advertising, from podcasts, digital and streaming, to the old standbys of radio, television, and billboards. The GSMC Marketing News Podcast has you covered, whether you're a marketing agent or a business trying to expand your brand.
Okay, welcome back, folks. So, you've heard about the Chrysler Minivans. You've heard about the specifications, the history, and I've even given you a crash course on the history of the 1980s as far as cars and major world events go. So now, let's get started with my personal thoughts. The Chrysler Minivans, I have fond memories of these vehicles. Because I had first started getting into cars probably right around the age of 4 years old. My dad bought me a box of toy cars for my brother. Not just these cheap little toy cars, but we loved them. And we had lots of toy cars growing up. And I still have a bunch of my toy cars from my childhood, locked away somewhere in storage, and some of them in my closet that I don't use anymore. Now I drive real cars, so I don't need small cars anymore. But nonetheless, the Chrysler Minivan, I have fond memories because we lived in what they called a mother-daughter house up in Linden, New Jersey, is where I spent the early years of my childhood. And upstairs we lived, and the downstairs was rented to some family friends of my dad's. Tati Keket and Papi Gracia. That's what we call them. I'm Haitian, so every woman who wasn't related to you but was older was Tati, aunt, and then every man was mon oncle, or in this case, Papi, and then that's what we called them. Tati Keket and Papi Gracia. They had a burgundy Plymouth Voyager, and it was the second generation Plymouth Voyager. And this car was, I can still remember, parked at the edge of our driveway, parallel parked along the street. And then Papi Gracia had an 80s Honda Accord coupe with the flip-up headlights. And I remember they were Adventists. They used to go to church on Saturday. And one day, we went to church with them on Saturday, and we all piled into this minivan. And as a kid, I always thought it was so strange that it only had 3 doors. And the rear door was only on the right side. And of course, years later, like 20 years later, I now know why that was done. But I had fond memories. And of course, that wasn't the only Chrysler minivan that I saw at the time period. Chrysler Group minivan. This one was a Plymouth. The folks next door used to have a Mazda MPV. And we're talking about these really old, ugly Mazda MPVs. They were Portuguese. And when I went to go visit my mom still lives in that same house. Those people were still living next door, 10-something years later. Or 15, 20 years later. Because last time I saw her was 2019. So they were still living in that house 15, 20 years later. And then I remember the time period, probably 2001. They had traded their Mazda MPV in for a Dodge Grand Caravan. It was a purple Dodge Grand Caravan. I still remember that. And the teacher at my preschool, or the counselor, I can't really call them teachers, the counselor at my preschool, she had a green she had a green Dodge Grand Caravan. I still remember these vans from my childhood because any American born after the 1980s or during the 1980s is going to remember the Chrysler Town and Country, the Plymouth Voyager, and the Dodge Grand Caravan because these were your quintessential people movers. This is what every suburban family had. Because at the time period, station wagons were on the way out. Our first car, my dad's first car, was a 1980s Oldsmobile Cutlass Sierra wagon. So we had a station wagon too, and my dad swore he would never drive a minivan. And to this day, he has still never driven or owned a minivan. So he was one of the few suburban dads that didn't have a minivan. But all of my friends, all of their parents had minivans. All of the kids at the parent pickup lines, if you came from a family that had 2 or 3 kids, you had minivans. I can think, we had youth groups. All of them had minivans. Driver's ed at school, they had minivans. I mean, everywhere you went, there were minivans if you lived in suburban America like I did. I can remember my friend Max Ferris. His mother had a Honda Odyssey. And then our family friends, Tutmago and Uncle Lemek, had a Toyota Sienna. And then Jason Pulowski, at my youth group in Cape Coral, at Cape Christian, He had a Chrysler Town and Country. He had like a 2000-something model. Really nice on the inside. Chris Euler, my former youth pastor, had, I believe, a Toyota Sienna. All of these people that I'm name dropping, all of them had minivans. And who started the minivan? Chrysler. Chrysler. None of these vehicles would exist if Chrysler had not come out with the minivan. It's crazy. It's crazy. I mean, the station wagon had been around since the early 1900s. They sort of started out as people carriers, as depot hacks is what they called them. They were large, open, wooden-bodied, with several rows of seats to haul people to and from train depots or airports when airports became a thing. And then they slowly evolved into the family vehicle. There were station wagons in the 30s, in the 40s, in the 50s, in the 60s, in the 70s, in the 80s, in the 90s, but in the 80s, they would slowly be replaced by the station wagon. Imagine what type of vehicle and what type of marketing you would have to do to dethrone a vehicle, a class of vehicle that had been around almost since the inception of the car. That's how brilliant Lee Iacocca was. And I just had to put it in there. Thank God for Lee Iacocca. Chrysler almost didn't go through with their idea of a minivan. If they hadn't, they would have definitely been goners. The whole entire Chrysler Corporation would have fallen apart. I guarantee it. But they persevered. They persevered. And who allowed them to persevere? Lee Iacocca. Lee Iacocca is probably one of the most, if not actually one of the most, important figures in American automotive history. You have people like Lee Iacocca. You have people like Henry Ford. You have people like Ransom Olds, Henry M. Leland, Walter P. Chrysler. I would put Lee Iacocca up with all of them. If they were all in heaven, goodness, they would all be sitting at the same table because they were all titans of the automotive industry. And then, of course, you had, famous designers like Harley Earl who came out with tail fins and whatnot. But tail fins were inconsequential. Tail fins were a fad that were here and gone. Lee Iacocca knew what he was doing when he pressed Chrysler to manufacture that minivan. Because he knew it was the way of the future. This man was a visionary. Lee Iacocca's ideas and things are still relevant today. Even a few years after his death, and even after a few decades of leaving the car industry. The Mustang was his idea. The Mustang is still going strong. From 1964 all the way up until 2021. As far as I'm concerned, the Mustang never skipped a beat. There was a Mustang from then till now. Every single year, there was a Mustang. Who started it? Lee Iacocca. The Chrysler Minivan. Chrysler Minivan is still relevant today. Chrysler, that he saved from the dead, is still relevant today. His idea of badge engineering and using a platform and marketing it across several marks of the same company. Who did it? Chrysler. And who caused it to happen? Lee Iacocca. The concept of the K car is still relevant today. Even though the K cars themselves are long gone, but the concept is still relevant today. We have so much to thank Lee Iacocca for and his genius in the car world, in the car industry. Because if it had not been for him, we wouldn't have had the Mustang, we wouldn't have had Chrysler in general, and we definitely wouldn't have had Chrysler minivans. And if it hadn't been for him, we wouldn't have any minivans. Or if we did have minivans, minivans could have been a lot different. Who knows what the future of the minivan could have been? Of course, nowadays, the minivan is gradually being replaced by the crossover, but such is the times. The minivan had a reign, I would say, for a good 40-something years. For a good 40 years. Because from the 1980s, they had the 1980s, the 90s, the 2000s, and the 2010s, and we're into the 2020s, in which the minivan is still relevant today. But of course, you've got the crossover. And the crossover is doing the same thing that the minivan did to the station wagon, just gradually replacing them. Because now, people want everything in the vehicle. People want sport. People want off-road capability. People want high seating position. People want power. People want luxury. People want this. People want that. And such is the taste of the modern people, the crossover really satisfies the urges that they have. The crossover, I should say, satisfies the urges that they have. You can get a sporty crossover. You can get an off-road crossover. You can get a luxurious crossover. You can get a crossover with plenty of power. You can get a crossover with towing capacity. And you can get a crossover that's stylish. The minivan, you know what? Not so much. The minivan is pretty much limited. The minivan is limited in the sense that the minivan has to really have sliding doors. The minivan, I can't say you can't be a powerful minivan. Chrysler's thinking about swapping one of their minivans out with a Hellcat motor. Do with that as you see fit. Do with that what you wish. But the minivan is never going to be off-road capable, unless you talk about the Mitsubishi Delica. But then again, is that really a minivan? That's more of a cargo van turned off-road van. But then again, that's not even offered in the United States. So the minivan, there's only so much you could do with it. It's a lot easier to pack all of that stuff into a crossover vehicle than it would a minivan. And thus, the minivan may not go out completely, but the minivan is steadily losing relevance. And that's okay, because the minivan had its time to shine. Just as the station wagon had its time to shine, the minivan had its time to shine. Will station wagons always exist? Station wagons will always exist. Will minivans always exist? Yes, they will. Will crossovers always exist? Yes, they will as well. Because, like it or not, there will always be a niche for these people. For me, for example, I will not be caught dead driving a minivan. I will not be caught dead owning one either. If I were to have a people hauler, I would have an SUV or a station wagon. Or just a sedan, because I don't plan on having a ton of children anyway. But there you have it. There's the story of the Chrysler Minivans, the Plymouth Voyager, the Dodge Grand Caravan, and the Chrysler Town and Country. Folks, don't forget to follow us on social media, on YouTube, on Twitter, on Spreaker, on Apple Podcasts, and on Instagram, hence why I've been doing this series. We've got about 4 decades left. We got the 90s. Oh, no, we've only got 2 decades left after. 3. I can't do math. 3 decades left after this. We've got the 90s. We've got the 2000s. We've got the 2010s. Oh, actually, we do have 4 decades. And we've got the 2020s, in which I'm going to try to make a prediction when we get around to the 2020s as what would be the most influential car of this decade. Or at least the most influential class of vehicles this decade. Which, if you're privy to car news, you might guess what direction I might be going in. But we'll see. So, thank you for listening. You have been listening to the GSMC Car Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. Once again, I am your host, David Lucy Mabel. Thank you, folks, and have a good night.
You've been listening to the GSMC Car Podcast, part of the GSMC Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type GSMC into your favorite podcast app to find all of the shows from the GSMC Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, from business news to weird news. Please subscribe to the podcast and follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you've enjoyed today's episode.